Settle yourself, dear listener, into a place where voices are lowered, movements are deliberate, and peace is carefully curated. Blackmere Spa Retreat lies hidden among rolling countryside, its stone building softened by mist and manicured gardens. From a distance, it appears a sanctuary, an escape from noise, urgency, and consequence. Guests arrive seeking renewal. They speak in whispers. They surrender watches, schedules, and the outside world in exchange for tranquility. Here, silence is not merely encouraged, it is enforced. Steam drifts endlessly through tiled corridors. Mineral pools glow beneath dim lanterns. Attendants move like shadows, guiding guests from treatment to treatment with calm efficiency. Every element is designed to soothe, to quiet the mind, to still the body. But silence, when imposed, can conceal far more than it reveals. On the morning our story begins, a guest fails to rise from a heated mineral pool, following a guided silent therapy session. There is no struggle, no cry for help, only stillness, complete and absolute. The staff responds swiftly, yet calmly. The death is attributed to a pre-existing condition, an unfortunate but not uncommon occurrence in such restorative environments. The retreat resumes its hush. Into this controlled calm arrives Hercule Poirot, invited not by alarm, but by uncertainty. Poirot understands that places devoted to wellness are built on trust, and that trust, when unquestioned, becomes a perfect cover for harm. At Blackmere, guests surrender their agency willingly. They stop asking questions. They stop watching one another. As Poirot begins to observe the rituals of the retreat, the measured meals, the shared silences, the carefully scheduled therapies, he senses something profoundly unsettling. Silence here is not absence. It is structure. It directs behavior, limits communication, and ensures compliance. Someone at Blackmere knew exactly how to exploit that structure. As you listen, pay attention not to what is said, but to what is withheld. Watch how calm can be manufactured, how wellness can be weaponized, and how poison may arrive without taste, scent, or sound. Tonight, you are invited into Blackmere Spa Retreat. Lower your voice, slow your breath, and remember, in places where silence is sacred, truth must learn to whisper. The stillness that killed. At Blackmere Spa Retreat, mornings did not begin with noise. They unfolded gently, like breath returning after sleep. Soft chimes marked the hour. Curtains were drawn back just enough to admit pale countryside light. Attendants moved through corridors in felted slippers, their footsteps absorbed by thick rugs and deliberate design. Even doors closed without sound. It was into this cultivated stillness that death arrived, quietly, obediently, almost politely. Hercule Poirot stood beside the mineral pool where the body had been found, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture perfectly composed. Steam rose in slow curls from the water's surface, blurring the lantern-lit tiles and softening the faces of those gathered nearby. The pool glowed faintly, a deceptive warmth masking the chill that had settled over the room. The deceased was Mrs. Evelyn Harrowby, 61, a recent arrival at the retreat. She had been discovered reclined against the edge of the pool at the conclusion of a guided, silent immersion therapy. Eyes closed, expression serene. At first, no one had suspected anything was wrong. In a place like Blackmere, stillness was expected. It was only when an attendant touched her shoulder, gently, professionally, that concern replaced calm. "She was cold," the attendant said quietly, her voice barely rising above the whisper the retreat encouraged. "Too cold." The medical officer, summoned swiftly, had declared death from cardiac arrest exacerbated by heat exposure. A tragic but plausible explanation. Mrs. Harrowby had disclosed a heart condition during intake. Forms had been signed. Waivers acknowledged. The system had worked. Poirot, however, was not interested in systems that worked too neatly. He knelt beside the pool, peering into the water through the rising steam. "Tell me," he asked softly, "how long was the session?" 90 minutes, replied Dr. Leonard Ashcombe, Blackmere's resident wellness physician. A tall man with calming features and a voice trained to soothe, Ashcombe radiated professional reassurance. "We monitor all guests carefully." "And during this time," Poirot continued, "no one speaks?" Ashcombe shook his head. "Silence is essential to the therapy. It allows the body to release tension." Poirot nodded. "And observation?" "Visual checks only," Ashcombe replied. "We do not disturb the experience." Poirot rose slowly, steam clinging to the hem of his trousers. He glanced around the room. Several guests stood nearby, wrapped in pale robes, their expressions composed but uneasy. They had been present during the session, silent witnesses to a death they had not recognized. "You were all here," Poirot said gently, "and yet no one noticed anything unusual." A woman near the back shifted uncomfortably. "We were instructed not to look directly at one another, to remain inward." "Ah," Poirot murmured, "inward." He turned his attention to the pool's edge, examining a small wooden tray where infused water and herbal supplements had been placed before the session began. Tiny ceramic cups rested neatly in a row, their contents long since diluted by steam and time. Poirot lifted one cup, inhaling carefully. "Chamomile," he said, "and valerian. Calming." Ashcombe nodded. "Standard." Poirot's eyes lingered on the tray. "Standard," he repeated, "but not mandatory?" "No," Ashcombe replied. "Guests may decline." Poirot glanced toward the intake records, laid out neatly on a nearby desk. Mrs. Harrowby's file lay open, a pale ribbon marking her page. "Did Mrs. Harrowby decline?" Poirot asked. Ashcombe hesitated. "No." Poirot's gaze sharpened, not dramatically, but perceptibly. He moved to the file, scanning it quickly. "Heart condition disclosed, medication listed, dietary sensitivities noted." Poirot paused. "But no toxicology screen ordered." Ashcombe stiffened slightly. "There was no indication." Poirot raised a hand. "I understand, Doctor. In places devoted to healing, suspicion is considered impolite." He turned back toward the pool. "Mrs. Harrowby did not struggle," Poirot said quietly. "There are no signs of distress, no disruption. She died as she lived her final moments, Still, compliant, silent. Poirot looked at the guests again. "And that," he continued, "is precisely what troubles me." Silence, Poirot knew, removed friction. It prevented interruption. It discouraged inquiry. In the mineral pool, with steam blurring vision and ritual discouraging movement, a person could fade from life without anyone noticing the precise moment. Poirot straightened. "Who guided this session?" he asked. A woman stepped forward, Miss Clara Vane, the retreat's senior facilitator. Her expression was serene, practiced. "I did." Poirot studied her carefully. "And where were you positioned?" "At the far end of the pool," she replied. "Observing." "Observing," Poirot echoed. "But not intervening." She nodded. "Intervention breaks the therapy." Poirot smiled faintly. "And therapy, madame, can sometimes break the patient." A hush fell over the room, not imposed, but earned. Poirot closed Mrs. Harrowby's file gently. "This death," he said, "has been mistaken for tranquility. But tranquility can be manufactured." He looked around once more. "And when silence is enforced," Poirot concluded, "it becomes the perfect accomplice." The Rules of Quiet. At Blackmere Spa Retreat, silence was not accidental. It was designed. Hercule Poirot understood this as he walked the grounds later that afternoon, accompanied by Dr. Leonard Ashcombe. Gravel paths crunched softly underfoot, quickly absorbed by hedges trimmed to perfection. Even nature here seemed disciplined. Birds scarce, fountains muted, wind redirected by carefully placed walls and foliage. "Guests come here to escape noise," Ashcombe said calmly, as if reciting a mantra. "Silence allows healing." Poirot smiled politely. "Yes, and also obedience." Ashcombe paused, but said nothing. Poirot requested a full explanation of Blackmere's silent protocols, and Ashcombe complied readily. The rules were printed, elegant, and reassuringly firm. Silence during treatments. Limited conversation during meals. No clocks, no personal devices. Questions deferred to scheduled consultations. "All very soothing," Poirot remarked, "and very efficient." They entered the silent dining hall, where guests ate together without speaking, communicating only through nods and small gestures. Attendants moved between tables, pouring water, adjusting plates, responding instantly to raised fingers. Poirot observed carefully. No one asked questions, no one complained, no one compared experiences. "During Mrs. Harrowby's stay," Poirot asked quietly, "did she ever express discomfort?" Ashcombe shook his head. "She followed the program precisely." Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. "Did she ever attempt to break silence?" Ashcombe hesitated. "Once, on her second evening." Poirot stopped walking. "And?" "She asked another guest if the pools were always this intense." Miss Vane reminded her gently of the rules. Poirot nodded. "And after that?" She complied. Poirot resumed walking. Compliance, Poirot knew, was often mistaken for consent. He next requested to speak with Miss Clara Vane, the senior facilitator. They met in a softly lit conservatory, steam drifting in from nearby baths, the air heavy with lavender and mineral salt. "You enforce silence," Poirot said gently. "I protect it," Vane replied smoothly. "Guests arrive broken. Noise overwhelms them. "And silence?" Poirot asked. "Silence gives structure." Poirot leaned back slightly. "Structure can be comforting or controlling." Vane smiled serenely. "There is no difference." Poirot studied her closely. "During this session," Poirot said, "Mrs. Harrowby consumed the herbal infusion?" "Yes." "And who prepares it?" "The wellness staff," Vane replied, "according to Dr. Ashcombe's specifications." Poirot's gaze flicked briefly toward the door. "And the cups," Poirot continued, "are distributed personally?" "Yes," Vane said. "Ritual matters." Poirot nodded slowly. "Ritual," he repeated, "creates expectation, and expectation discourages scrutiny." Poirot then requested to review the guest rotation chart. Blackmere ran with almost military precision. Guests moved through therapies in carefully staggered sequences, ensuring no overcrowding and minimal unsupervised interaction. Poirot traced a finger down the chart. "Mrs. Harrowby shared the pool with 6 others," Poirot said, "all strangers, all silent, all instructed to look inward." "Yes," Ashcombe confirmed. Poirot closed the chart. "So," Poirot said softly, "no one noticed when she stopped breathing, because noticing would have required breaking the rules." They returned to the mineral pool room. The water had been refreshed. The space looked unchanged, pristine, peaceful. Poirot crouched again by the tray of cups. "One question," Poirot said. "If a guest feels unwell during silence, what happens?" Ashcombe answered carefully. "They raise a hand. An attendant responds." "And if the guest is already too weak?" Poirot asked. Silence followed. Poirot straightened. "At Blackmere," Poirot said calmly, "silence is presented as care, but it also removes resistance." He turned toward Ashcombe and Vane together. "Someone here understood that perfectly." Poirot glanced once more at the pool. "In a place where voices are forbidden," Poirot concluded, "poison does not need to shout." Wellness as weapon. Hercule Poirot had long ago learned that crimes rarely announce themselves as crimes. They prefer respectable disguises. At Blackmere Spa Retreat, wellness was the disguise, and it was an excellent one. Everything here spoke the language of care: measured tones, soft lighting, gentle rituals, the promise of restoration. Yet Poirot knew that when harm hides behind benevolence, it often does so with the confidence that no one will dare to look too closely. Poirot requested access to the wellness preparation room. It was a pristine space, tiled in pale stone, shelves lined with glass jars bearing handwritten labels: valerian, chamomile, passion flower, digitalis extract. Each jar was arranged with meticulous symmetry, reinforcing the impression of order and trust. A faint herbal scent hung in the air, soothing and misleading. Poirot stopped in front of one shelf. "Digitalis," he said quietly. Dr. Ashcombe stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Used in extremely small, controlled doses. It strengthens the heart." "And in slightly less controlled doses?" Poirot asked. Ashcombe met his gaze. "It stops it." Poirot nodded. "A poison that masquerades as medicine." He lifted the jar carefully, examining the seal. It had been opened recently. "Who has access to this room?" Poirot asked. "Wellness staff only," Ashcombe replied. "Myself, Miss Vane, and 2 senior attendants." Poirot replaced the jar gently.
Mrs. Harrowby had a heart condition, Poirot said, which means digitalis would appear appropriate.
Ashcombe's voice was calm. Her intake form listed no contraindications. Poirot turned slightly.
Did she know she was receiving it?
Ashcombe hesitated. The infusions are described generally. Guests trust the program.
Trust, Poirot echoed. Another powerful sedative.
Poirot moved to the preparation table where cups were arranged in rows, identical in size and shape. He picked one up, turning it slowly between his fingers.
During the silent therapy, Poirot said, each guest receives a cup prepared individually. Yes, replied Miss Vane, who had entered quietly. The ritual is part of the experience. Poirot smiled faintly. Ritual creates immunity from suspicion. Poirot asked to see the dispensing log. Miss Vane retrieved it at once. The entries were neat, minimal, and precise. Ingredients listed in abbreviated form. Quantities standardized. Poirot scanned the page corresponding to Mrs. Harrowby's final session. His finger stopped. This notation, Poirot said softly. A slight variation. Ashcombe leaned in. It's within acceptable range. Poirot shook his head. Acceptable is not the same as invisible. Poirot closed the logbook. Someone here, Poirot continued, knew exactly how much to add, enough to still the heart without provoking distress, enough that death would resemble serenity. Miss Vane folded her hands. You are suggesting intentional harm? Poirot looked at her steadily. I am suggesting intention disguised as care. Poirot then requested to review Mrs. Harrowby's personal interactions since arriving at Blackmere. Records showed minimal conversation, by design. But Poirot noticed something else. Mrs. Harrowby had requested an unscheduled consultation on her third day. With whom? Poirot asked. With me, Ashcombe said quietly. And what was discussed? Poirot asked. Ashcombe hesitated again. She expressed concern. She felt weaker, dizzy after sessions. Poirot's eyes sharpened. And did you adjust her program? No, Ashcombe replied. I reassured her. Poirot nodded slowly. To reassure, he said, is sometimes to silence. Poirot walked back toward the mineral pool room, imagining the final session with fresh clarity. Steam thickening the air. Guests trained not to observe one another. A cup prepared with care and calculation. Mrs. Harrowby reclined, her heart slowed, and no one spoke. Poirot turned back toward Ashcombe and Vane. This was not a reckless act, Poirot said quietly. It required knowledge, access, and an understanding of how silence protects. He folded his hands. Someone here understood that wellness could be weaponized. The room felt suddenly smaller, and for the first time since Poirot arrived at Blackmere, the silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt deliberate. The calm that conceals calm, Poirot reflected, was not the absence of disturbance, it was the presence of control. At Blackmere Spa Retreat, calm was cultivated with precision. It flowed through the corridors, settled into the muscles of guests, and wrapped itself around every interaction like a soft but unyielding bandage. And as Poirot stood in the wellness preparation room, the implications of that calm became uncomfortably clear. He requested that all senior staff involved in guest care be assembled, not for accusation, but for observation. They gathered in the conservatory as before. Dr. Leonard Ashcombe, composed and reassuring, Miss Clara Vane, serene to the point of opacity, and two senior attendants, Margaret Llewellyn and Jonah Price, both disciplined, deferential, and visibly anxious to be helpful. Steam drifted lazily from the baths beyond the glass, blurring the boundary between inside and outside. Poirot addressed them gently. "At Blackmere," he said, "you do not raise your voices. You do not hurry. You do not interrupt. These are admirable principles." He paused, allowing the group to relax, just slightly. "But principles," Poirot continued, "can also be procedures, and procedures can be exploited." He turned first to Margaret Llewellyn. "You prepared the infusion tray on the morning of Mrs. Harrowby's final session?" "Yes," Margaret replied softly, "as assigned." "And did anything differ from routine?" Poirot asked. Margaret shook her head quickly. "No, monsieur. Everything was measured." Poirot nodded. "Measured is not the same as verified." He turned next to Jonah Price.
"You delivered the tray to the pool room?" "Yes." "And remained there?" Poirot asked. "Only briefly," Jonah replied. "We do not linger." Poirot smiled faintly. "At Blackmere, lingering is discouraged." Poirot then faced Dr. Ashcombe. "Mrs. Harrowby complained of dizziness," Poirot said. "You reassured her." Ashcombe nodded. "It is common during detoxification." "And yet," Poirot continued, "you did not alter her treatment." Ashcombe's jaw tightened. "The program is carefully balanced." "Balanced," Poirot echoed, "or inflexible." Poirot shifted his attention to Miss Vane. "You guide the silent therapies," Poirot said. "You enforce the rules." "I protect the integrity of the experience," Vane replied evenly. "And during that experience," Poirot asked, "you positioned yourself where?" "At the far end of the pool," she said. "As always." Poirot walked slowly across the room, stopping at the spot she indicated. "From here," Poirot said, "steam obscures the far edge of the pool, vision is partial, and sound irrelevant." He turned back toward the group. "This positioning," Poirot said, "ensures calm. It also ensures privacy." No one spoke. Poirot continued calmly, reconstructing not the act itself, but its environment. "Mrs. Harrowby consumed an infusion containing digitalis," Poirot said, "a compound appropriate in minute doses, dangerous in slightly higher ones, administered orally, tasteless when masked by herbs." Ashcombe inhaled sharply. "We would never!" Poirot raised a hand. "I am not accusing yet," he said. "I am explaining." Poirot moved to the tray table, placing 6 identical cups in a row. "One cup," Poirot continued, "contained a marginally increased dose, not enough to cause distress, enough to slow the heart gradually, peacefully." He looked around the group. "Such a dose would require knowledge of Mrs. Harrowby's condition, access to the preparation room, and confidence that no one would intervene." Poirot's gaze rested briefly on each face. "Confidence," Poirot said, "comes from authority." He turned back to Miss Vane. "You discourage interruption," Poirot said. "You discourage observation. You discourage speech." Vane's smile did not waver. "Because silence heals." Poirot's voice softened. "And silence also isolates." Poirot then produced a small note from his pocket.
"This," he said, "was found in Mrs. Harrowby's room." It was a folded page torn from her notebook. "I feel weaker after sessions. Something is wrong." The group absorbed this in silence, this time not imposed. Poirot continued. "She attempted to speak," Poirot said. "She requested reassurance. She was told this was normal." Ashcombe looked away. Poirot folded the note carefully. "The killer," Poirot said, "did not rely on chaos. They relied on calm. They trusted that no one would question tranquility." Poirot stepped back. "At Blackmere," he concluded, "calm is not neutral. It is curated. And someone here curated it to lethal effect." The conservatory felt suddenly airless. Poirot did not press further, not yet. He had not named the hand, but he had exposed the design. And once calm was understood as concealment, it could no longer protect its author. Who profits from peace? When calm becomes currency, someone is always trading in it. Hercule Poirot understood this as he reviewed the administrative records of Blackmere Spa Retreat later that evening. The retreat had settled back into its disciplined hush, as though the death of Mrs. Evelyn Harrowby were an inconvenience rather than a rupture. Guests moved from therapy to therapy. Attendants bowed their heads. Silence resumed its role as both promise and shield. Poirot, however, had shifted his attention. Crimes of this nature were never motivated by impulse. They were motivated by advantage, subtle, layered, often hidden beneath altruistic language. To understand who had poisoned Mrs. Harrowby, Poirot needed to understand who gained when she stopped asking questions.
He requested the financial and governance records of Blackmere. Dr. Ashcombe complied with visible reluctance, but no refusal. Transparency, after all, was part of the brand. Poirot seated himself at a long oak table in the administrative wing, papers spread neatly before him. At first glance, Blackmere appeared thriving. Bookings were strong, testimonials glowing. The retreat had recently been featured in several prominent wellness publications. Poirot's eyes moved past the praise. He examined timelines. Mrs. Harrowby had not been an ordinary guest. She was a silent investor. Her name appeared quietly on a subsidiary document, minority stakeholder, recently acquired. Poirot's eyebrows rose just slightly. "Interesting," he murmured. Poirot summoned Dr. Ashcombe and Miss Vane together. "Mrs. Harrowby invested in Blackmere," Poirot said calmly. "Not a large share, but enough to request oversight." Ashcombe stiffened. "She expressed interest, yes?" "And interest," Poirot replied, "leads to questions." Miss Vane folded her hands. "She admired our work." Poirot nodded. "And then she began to doubt it." Poirot slid a document across the table. "Mrs. Harrowby requested access to safety audits," Poirot continued. "She asked about ingredient sourcing, dosage oversight, and incident reporting." Ashcombe's expression tightened. "She misunderstood our methods." Poirot's voice remained gentle. "She understood them well enough to be concerned." Poirot leaned back. "She complained of dizziness. She questioned the effects. She asked for documentation. And then she died peacefully." The implications settled heavily. Poirot turned to Miss Vane. "You enforce silence," Poirot said. "You discourage interruption. You guide behavior."
Vane's voice remained steady. "For healing and for compliance," Poirot replied. Poirot then addressed Ashcombe. "You design the programs," Poirot said. "You control the compounds." Ashcombe exhaled slowly. "Within ethical bounds." Poirot smiled faintly.
Ethics are most tested when profit is threatened. Poirot requested to speak privately with Margaret Llewellyn, one of the senior attendants. She arrived nervous, clasping her hands tightly. "You prepared the infusions?" Poirot said kindly. "Did you ever question the variations?" Margaret hesitated. "We're trained not to." "Not to question?" Poirot repeated. "Dr. Ashcombe says the measurements," she whispered, "are his responsibility." Poirot nodded. "And Miss Vane?" Poirot asked. "She ensures we follow the rules," Margaret replied. "Silence. No deviation." Poirot thanked her gently and dismissed her. The pattern was clear now. Knowledge was centralized, questioning discouraged, silence enforced. Poirot returned to the conservatory where Miss Vane stood alone, gazing out at the steam-draped gardens. "You believe silence creates safety," Poirot said. "It does," Vane replied. "Noise causes harm." Poirot tilted his head. "And questions?" Vane did not answer immediately. Poirot continued softly. "Mrs. Harrowby threatened the retreat's image," Poirot said. "A guest investor questioning wellness protocols is dangerous, not legally, but reputationally." Vane turned slowly. "We help people." "And you help them by ensuring they do not speak," Poirot replied. Poirot's gaze sharpened. "You positioned yourself so you could observe, but not intervene," Poirot said. "You ensured no one looked at Mrs. Harrowby directly. You enforced stillness." Vane's composure faltered for the first time. Poirot did not accuse her yet. Instead, he concluded calmly. "This death preserved Blackmere's calm," Poirot said. "It protected its image. It protected its authority." Poirot gathered his papers. "Peace," Poirot said quietly, "is very profitable when it cannot be questioned." He stepped toward the door, then paused. "The killer," Poirot added, "did not fear being seen. They feared being heard." The silence that followed was no longer obedient. It was afraid. The moment silence fractures. Silence, Poirot believed, could survive scrutiny, but not insistence. At Blackmere Spa Retreat, insistence had been carefully engineered out of existence. Guests surrendered their voices. Staff surrendered initiative. Authority flowed downward, smooth and uninterrupted. And yet, beneath that cultivated calm, tension had begun to accumulate, like pressure beneath sealed glass. Poirot intended to tap it. He requested that the entire senior staff be present during the evening mineral immersion, not as observers, but as participants. The request was unusual. At Blackmere, observation was hierarchical. Participation was controlled. Miss Clara Vane resisted politely. Disrupting the program would unsettle guests. Poirot smiled. That is precisely the point. The session proceeded under modified conditions. The pool room filled with steam as lanterns were dimmed to their usual twilight glow. Guests entered silently, robes exchanged for towels, bodies lowering themselves into the mineral-rich water with practiced calm. But tonight, something was different. Staff were present at every station. Miss Vane stood at her customary place, but so did Dr. Ashcombe, Margaret Llewellyn, and Jonah Price. And Poirot sat quietly at the edge of the pool, visible, unhidden, his presence alone a disruption. The rules of silence were announced. Poirot waited. As the session progressed, Poirot watched not the guests, but the staff. He observed where eyes lingered, where attention faltered, where authority asserted itself through gesture alone. 20 minutes in, Poirot did something forbidden. He spoke. "Madame," Poirot said calmly, addressing a guest seated near the pool's center, "are you comfortable?" The woman startled slightly, glancing instinctively toward Miss Vane. Miss Vane's hand lifted, not sharply, but decisively. Poirot watched the gesture closely. Authority, he noted, did not need words. The guest nodded uncertainly. Poirot continued.
Louder now, not disruptive, but unmistakable. "During the last session," Poirot said, "Mrs. Harrowby felt unwell. She did not speak. She trusted the rules." A ripple passed through the room, not movement, but awareness. Poirot turned toward Miss Vane. "You believe silence heals," Poirot said evenly, "but tonight silence will answer questions." Poirot gestured toward the infusion tray prepared for the session. "Doctor," Poirot said, "will you describe exactly what has been added to these cups?"
Ashcombe hesitated. "They are standard preparations," he said. Poirot nodded.
"Then it will not trouble you to describe them."
Ashcombe cleared his throat. "Herbal sedatives, mineral stabilizers, digitalis, microdosed."
Poirot's voice was calm. "For everyone?"
Ashcombe paused. "Adjusted as needed."
Poirot turned to the guests. "You hear?" Poirot said gently. "Adjustments are made, but you are not told."
Miss Vane stepped forward.
"This is inappropriate."
Poirot raised a hand, not to silence her, but to stop her authority from flowing unchecked.
"No," Poirot said. "This is necessary."
Poirot then turned to Margaret Llewellyn.
"You prepared the infusion for Mrs. Harrowby's final session," Poirot said.
Margaret nodded, pale.
"And who instructed you?"
Poirot asked. Margaret's eyes flicked instinctively, not to Ashcombe, but to Miss Vane. The room felt suddenly tighter. Poirot continued gently.
"You were told it was within range,"
Poirot said.
"You were told not to question."
Margaret swallowed.
"Yes."
Poirot turned back to Miss Vane.
"You enforce silence,"
Poirot said.
"You shape behavior. You ensure no one interrupts."
Vane's voice remained steady, but her breathing had changed.
"I maintain order."
Poirot inclined his head.
"And in doing so, you ensured that when Mrs. Harrowby began to fail, no one would notice in time."
Poirot stepped closer.
"You knew Mrs. Harrowby was asking questions," Poirot said. "You knew she was an investor."
"You knew she threatened the image of Blackmere." Vane's jaw tightened.
"She was destabilizing the retreat."
Poirot nodded.
"And destabilization," he said softly, "was unacceptable."
Poirot turned back toward the guests.
"Mrs. Harrowby did not die violently," Poirot said. "She died correctly, calmly, within the rules."
Poirot's gaze fixed on Miss Vane again.
"You did not poison her directly," Poirot said. "You ordered the adjustment. You trusted that silence would finish the work."
The steam seemed to thicken. Dr. Ashcombe spoke suddenly. "She only asked that we maintain the protocol." Poirot turned sharply. "And you," Poirot said, "provided the means." Ashcombe's shoulders sagged. Poirot straightened. "At Blackmere," Poirot said, "silence fractured not when someone screamed, but when someone asked why." He gestured subtly. 2 constables entered the room quietly, respectfully. Miss Vane did not resist. As she was escorted away, she spoke once, softly, bitterly. "They came here to be controlled." Poirot replied gently, "No, madame. They came to be healed." The guests sat motionless, the spell broken. For the first time since Poirot arrived, the silence was no longer enforced. It was voluntary, and it trembled. After the quiet breaks, silence does not forgive being shattered. At Blackmere's spa retreat, the arrest of Miss Clara Vane did not bring relief, it brought disorientation. The very rule that had governed behavior, emotion, and even thought had been removed. Guests no longer knew where to rest their eyes or how to occupy their stillness. Staff moved uncertainly, glancing at one another for cues that no longer came. Hercule Poirot observed this carefully. He understood that when authority collapses, confusion follows, not because people crave control, but because they have been trained not to think aloud. Blackmere had not merely discouraged noise, it had discouraged judgment. Poirot met Dr. Leonard Ashcombe in the administrative office that evening.
The physician looked older now, his calm veneer stripped away by consequence. "I never intended her to die," Ashcombe said quietly. Poirot inclined his head. "Intention," he replied, "is rarely as precise as dosage." Ashcombe exhaled. Miss Vane believed discipline was essential, that guests must submit fully to the program. "And you," Poirot said gently, "believed chemistry would make that submission safe." Ashcombe said nothing. Poirot continued. "Digitalis was not introduced as murder," Poirot said. "It was introduced as correction. Control disguised as care." Ashcombe nodded slowly. "She asked for an increase, just a fraction." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "And you agreed?" "I believed," Ashcombe said, "that Mrs. Harraby's anxiety was destabilizing the retreat." Poirot folded his hands. "Anxiety," Poirot said, "is often the body protesting before the mind understands why." Outside the office, guests had begun to speak, quietly at first, then more freely. Conversations formed in hallways, near the pools, along the garden paths. Questions were asked, comparisons made, shared discomfort discovered. The retreat's atmosphere changed audibly. Poirot welcomed it. He requested that all guests be offered the option to leave early with full refunds and medical evaluations. Some departed immediately. Others stayed, not out of obedience, but curiosity. They wanted to understand what had happened to them. Poirot stood in the conservatory the next morning as sunlight filtered through steam-softened glass. Margaret Llewellyn approached him hesitantly. "I thought I was helping," she said. Poirot met her gaze kindly. "You were trained not to decide." She nodded, tears forming. "I didn't even taste the infusion." Poirot said softly, "That is how dangerous systems protect themselves." Poirot later accompanied investigators as they documented the preparation room. The digitalis jar was sealed as evidence. Logs were copied, testimonies recorded.
Miss Vane, when questioned formally,
remained composed. "People come to Blackmere to be relieved of choice," she said evenly. "Choice is exhausting." Poirot listened without interruption. "You believed," Poirot said at last, "that silence made people safe." "Yes," Vane replied. "Safe from themselves." Poirot shook his head gently. "No," he said. "Safe from objection."
The weight of that distinction settled heavily. As the investigation widened, it became clear that Mrs. Harrowby had not been the only guest to experience weakness. Minor incidents, dizziness, fainting, had been quietly absorbed by the system, documented as adjustment periods, forgotten. Poirot addressed the remaining staff one final time. "Blackmere did not fail because it was malicious," Poirot said. "It failed because it refused to listen." He paused. "Silence is useful," Poirot continued, "but only when it is chosen." By afternoon, Blackmere Spa Retreat was no longer silent. It hummed, not loudly, but honestly, and in that honesty, Poirot saw the first signs of healing. Once silence was broken, it did not rush back to reclaim its place. At Blackmere Spa Retreat, the absence of enforced quiet created something unfamiliar and unsettling: choice. Guests were no longer instructed where to look, when to speak, or how to interpret their own discomfort. The retreat, once choreographed to perfection, now moved unevenly, like a body relearning how to walk after long restraint. Hercule Poirot observed this transformation with careful interest. He remained at Blackmere not as an investigator now, but as a witness to consequence. He understood that the aftermath of control was as revealing as the control itself. When people were finally allowed to speak, what they said mattered less than the fact that they could. The dining hall, once governed by nods and gestures, filled with low conversation. Guests compared experiences, headaches dismissed as detox, dizziness framed as progress, fatigue praised as release. Individually,
each symptom had been minimized. Together, they formed a pattern. Poirot listened. A middle-aged man spoke of fainting during his third immersion session. A woman described heart palpitations that vanished once she stopped drinking the infusions. Another admitted she had wanted to leave on her second day but feared appearing resistant to the process. Poirot made no notes. He did not need to. Patterns, once voiced, arranged themselves. Dr. Ashcombe accompanied Poirot through the gardens that afternoon. The physician's calm had cracked, replaced by something closer to humility. "I believed in the method," Ashcombe said quietly. "Structure creates safety." Poirot nodded. "Structure creates predictability. Safety requires consent." Ashcombe looked toward the stone buildings of the retreat. "Miss Vane believed people came here to be relieved of responsibility." "And you allowed her to decide how far that relief went," Poirot replied gently. They paused beside the mineral spring that fed the pools. The water flowed steadily, unchanged by human intention. "Medicine," Poirot said, "must listen to the body. When it stops listening, it becomes coercion." Later that evening, Poirot met with Mrs. Harrowby's solicitor, who had arrived to collect documents and personal effects. The solicitor spoke carefully, professionally, but grief lay just beneath the surface. "She trusted this place," the woman said. "She invested because she believed wellness should be ethical." Poirot inclined his head. "She believed accountability was part of healing,"
The solicitor handed Poirot a sealed envelope. "She asked me to hold this," she said, "in case something happened." Poirot opened it slowly. Inside was a handwritten note from Mrs. Harrowby. "If silence is mandatory, something is being hidden." Poirot closed the letter carefully. That night, Poirot stood alone in the mineral pool room. The steam was lighter now, the lanterns brighter. Without the ritual hush, the space felt less mystical and more honest. Poirot imagined the final moments of Mrs. Harrowby once more, not as serenity, but as confusion restrained by obedience. A body failing quietly because it had been trained not to interrupt the system around it. Poirot's expression hardened, not with anger, but resolve. At Blackmere, silence had been sold as peace. But peace without choice, Poirot knew, was merely submission wearing a gentle mask. As night settled over the retreat, conversations continued, hesitant but persistent. Questions replaced compliance. And with every question asked aloud, the structure that had enabled the crime weakened further. Poirot allowed himself a small nod of approval. The most dangerous silence had already been broken. Responsibility without silence. When silence ruled Blackmere Spa Retreat, responsibility had been conveniently blurred. Now, with voices returning, responsibility demanded shape, and someone had to carry it. Hercule Poirot understood that justice was not complete with an arrest alone. Miss Clara Vane's removal and Dr. Ashcombe's confession explained how Mrs. Evelyn Harrowby had died, but they did not yet answer the deeper question: how such a system had been allowed to thrive unquestioned. Poirot began the day by requesting a full staff assembly. They gathered in the main hall, no longer whispering, no longer waiting for permission to speak. Faces showed exhaustion, guilt, confusion, and relief. For many, it was the first time they had stood together without hierarchy dictating posture and tone. Poirot addressed them calmly. "Mrs. Harrowby was not killed by poison alone," Poirot said. "She was killed by permission. Permission granted to silence." The words landed heavily. "You followed rules," Poirot continued. "You trusted authority. And because of that, no one interrupted what felt wrong." Margaret Llewellyn lowered her head. Poirot's voice softened. "This is not condemnation," he said. "It is understanding." Systems that discourage questioning do not require cruelty. They require compliance. Poirot then outlined what investigators had uncovered overnight. Minor adverse reactions quietly recorded, complaints smoothed over, language adjusted to reframe danger as progress. The retreat's reputation preserved not by deception, but by design. "Responsibility," Poirot said, "was distributed thinly enough that no one felt it fully." Later, Poirot met Inspector Caldwell from the regional authority, who had arrived to assume oversight. "This retreat will not reopen quickly," Caldwell said, "nor easily." Poirot nodded. "Nor should it." Together they reviewed revised operational protocols, mandatory verbal check-ins, informed consent disclosures, independent medical oversight, and unrestricted guest communication. Silence, if practiced, would now be optional. Poirot approved these changes, not because they restored order, but because they restored choice. That afternoon, Poirot visited Miss Vane one final time. She sat composed, hands folded, her voice still measured. "They wanted to surrender responsibility," she said. "I only gave them structure."
Poirot regarded her steadily. "You did not give them structure," Poirot replied. "You removed their right to refuse." Vane's composure faltered. Poirot continued quietly. "Mrs. Harrowby did not resist the program," Poirot said. "She resisted secrecy, and for that she was silenced permanently." Miss Vane looked away. Poirot left without another word. As evening fell, Poirot packed his belongings. The retreat grounds no longer felt hushed, just subdued, reflective. Guests spoke softly among themselves, not because they were required to, but because grief invites quiet naturally. Poirot paused by the garden fountain, listening to the water. Silence, he reflected, was not the enemy. Unquestioned silence was. Blackmere would not be remembered as a place of healing, nor solely as a place of crime.
It would be remembered as a warning, a demonstration of how easily benevolence could become control when voices were gently removed. Poirot adjusted his coat. Justice, he knew, had arrived not as punishment alone, but as responsibility restored. And that, Poirot believed, was the only kind that lasted. Blackmere's spa retreat greeted its final morning without ceremony. The mist still clung to the lawns, steam still rose from the mineral springs. The buildings, constructed to suggest permanence and calm, remained unchanged in stone and glass, yet the atmosphere was unmistakably different. Silence no longer ruled here, it merely existed, optional, fragile, honest. Hercule Poirot walked the grounds slowly, his small steps deliberate, his gaze attentive. He was preparing to leave, but, as always, he allowed a place to speak one last time before he departed. In the main hall, staff members were engaged in open conversation, quiet, respectful, but real. Questions were asked aloud, clarifications offered. No one waited for a raised hand or a nod of approval. The retreat was no longer choreographed. Poirot observed with approval. He met Dr. Leonard Ashcombe near the entrance, where investigators were completing their final review. "I will lose my license," Ashcombe said quietly. Poirot inclined his head. "And you will keep your conscience, if you allow it to learn." Ashcombe swallowed. "I believed calm justified everything." Poirot's voice was gentle but firm. "Calm justifies nothing when it replaces consent." They stood in silence for a moment, this time chosen. Poirot then walked to the mineral pool room for the final time. Without ritual hush, the room felt smaller, more human. The lanterns burned brighter, the steam thinned more quickly. It was no longer a sacred space. It was simply a room where water flowed. Poirot stood at the pool's edge. Mrs. Evelyn Harrowby had not come to Blackmere to surrender herself.
She had come to restore balance to her body, her mind, and, ultimately, to the system she believed in. When she questioned it, she exposed its weakness. And weakness, Poirot knew, frightened those who ruled through certainty. Poirot reflected on the nature of control. It did not always arrive through force. Sometimes it arrived through reassurance. Sometimes it arrived wrapped in kindness. And sometimes it arrived in silence. At Blackmere, poison had not been administered with hatred. It had been administered with confidence, the confidence that no one would interrupt, question, or speak. That confidence was now gone. Poirot met Inspector Caldwell once more at the gates. "The retreat will close indefinitely," Caldwell said. "There will be inquiries, reforms, oversight." Poirot nodded. "Good." "And Miss Vane?" Caldwell asked. "She believed," Poirot said softly.
that people wanted to be relieved of choice. Caldwell frowned. And you? Poirot adjusted his coat. I believe people want to be heard. The motor car arrived. Poirot took one last look at Blackmere Spa Retreat, its gardens, its stone walls, its quiet springs. The place would survive, but it would never be silent in the same way again. Poirot stepped into the car. As they drove away, the retreat receded into the mist, not erased, but transformed. Silence had lost its authority, and without authority, it could no longer kill. Do you think silence becomes dangerous when it replaces choice? Share your final thoughts in the comments. When voices return. And so, dear listener, we leave Blackmere Spa Retreat, not as it was, but as it has become. A place once governed by enforced calm now carries the echo of voices that refused to remain quiet. Mrs. Evelyn Harrowby's death was not loud, not violent, not chaotic. It was precise, polite, silent. And that is what made it so dangerous. Hercule Poirot did not solve this mystery by chasing shadows or forcing confessions. He listened to patterns, to absences,
to the quiet moments where obedience replaced consent. He understood that when people are trained not to speak, harm does not need to hide. This story reminds us that wellness without transparency becomes control, and calm without choice becomes confinement. Silence can heal, but only when it is freely chosen. If this mystery stayed with you, I invite you to share what struck you most. Was it the poison itself, or the system that allowed it to work unseen? Your thoughts matter, and I read them all. If you enjoy slow-burning, atmospheric mysteries where psychology and consequence take center stage, consider subscribing and joining us again. Many places promise peace. Not all of them deserve our trust. Until our next story, take care, listen closely, and remember, the most powerful voice is the one that refuses to be silenced.